been a few things that I've read that have kind of said this is like the saddest thing I've ever.
For 3 decades, Lisa Marie Presley carried memories of her father she never fully shared with anyone. Then she started recording them, alone, into hours of private audio. After she died, her daughter Riley sat down to listen. What she heard reshaped everything she thought she knew about her grandfather's final days, and about her own mother's quiet, lifelong grief. Today, in Riley Keough's own words, join us as we go inside those recordings. The grandchild who arrived too late.
The difficult moments, and I think that that's very true.
May the 29th, 1989 in Santa Monica, California, Danielle Riley Keough was born into a family already defined by absence. Her grandfather, Elvis Presley, had been dead for 12 years by the time she took her first breath. She would never hear his voice in person, never sit on his lap, never know him as anything other than a legend reconstructed through photographs, home movies, and the careful, curated memory of Graceland itself. She was, by birth, the eldest grandchild of the most famous entertainer in American history, and she would spend her entire childhood orbiting a man she had missed by over a decade. Her mother, Lisa Marie Presley, had been only 9 years old when Elvis died in August of 1977. This detail mattered enormously to how Riley eventually came to understand her own family's relationship with grief and memory. Lisa Marie had grown up inside the actual loss, old enough to remember her father directly, young enough that the loss reshaped the entirety of her remaining childhood. Riley grew up one full generation removed from that immediate grief, inheriting instead its long aftermath, carried by a mother who never fully set it down. Riley's parents, Lisa Marie and musician Danny Keough, divorced when she was 5 years old. This early separation introduced a pattern that would define much of Riley's childhood. Constant movement between households, between coasts, between dramatically different versions of what family instability looked like. She split time between her father's homes in Los Angeles and Hawaii and her mother's home in Los Angeles, with regular extended stays at Graceland itself, the sprawling Memphis estate her mother had inherited directly from Elvis. Graceland occupied a strange dual position in Riley's early life. It was, on one hand, simply her mother's inherited family home, a place she visited the way any child visits a parent's childhood property. On the other hand, it was one of the most visited private residences in the United States, a public monument to a grandfather she had never met, swarming with tourists paying admission to walk through rooms where her own mother had once lived as an ordinary little girl. This duality, family home and global tourist attraction simultaneously, shaped Riley's relationship with her grandfather's legacy in ways that took years to fully process. She inherited his fame without inheriting any direct, personal memory of the man himself. Everything she knew about Elvis Presley came secondhand, filtered through her mother's recollections, through Graceland's curated exhibits, through the broader cultural mythology that had grown up around him in the decades since his death. Lisa Marie's own marriages added further complexity to Riley's childhood. Following the divorce from Danny Keough, Lisa Marie married pop superstar Michael Jackson, a relationship that placed young Riley for a period, splitting time partly at Neverland Ranch, Jackson's elaborate California estate. This marriage proved short-lived, as did Lisa Marie's later marriage to actor Nicolas Cage, which lasted only 107 days before Cage filed for divorce. This pattern, repeated instability across her mother's personal relationships, layered on top of the constant movement between her parents' separate households, gave Riley what she would later describe as a hectic but ultimately balanced childhood. One that exposed her early to wildly different worlds and circumstances, even as it denied her the kind of stable, singular home life many children experience. Riley attended public school for a period in the San Fernando Valley before eventually transitioning to homeschooling, a shift driven largely by the practical difficulty of maintaining consistent school attendance while constantly traveling between her parents' various homes across different states. This educational disruption mirrored the broader pattern of her early life: constant adjustment, constant movement, very little that stayed fixed for long. Despite this instability, or perhaps in some ways because of it, Riley developed early independence and a notably practical mindset toward her own life circumstances, even as a young child. She began modeling at 15, appearing in major runway shows for designers including Dolce & Gabbana, before eventually transitioning toward acting in her early 20s. Throughout these years, her relationship with her grandfather's legacy remained something she carried at a distance, present in nearly every aspect of how the world perceived her, yet absent from her own direct personal experience. She was Elvis Presley's granddaughter in every practical public sense, recognized immediately by that connection wherever she went, while privately experiencing him only through the secondhand inheritance of stories, photographs, and her mother's carefully guarded memories. This particular kind of inherited absence, fame without first-hand memory, shaped Riley's relationship with her own family history in ways that would not fully surface until much later, following a loss considerably more immediate and personal than the grandfather she had never known. Her younger brother, Benjamin Storm Keogh, born in 1992, would become central to this later reckoning, his own life and eventual death in 2020, deepening Riley's understanding of exactly how heavily the weight of the Presley family's particular brand of loss and grief could settle onto each successive generation. For now, though, throughout her childhood and into her early adult years, Riley remained largely once removed from the deepest, most painful details of her family's history. Her mother carried those details privately, rarely speaking about them directly, even to her own children. That privacy would not last forever. Lisa Marie Presley, in her final years, made a decision that would eventually change everything Riley thought she understood about her family's past. She began to record it. The tapes nobody knew existed in her final years. Lisa Marie Presley began a project she kept almost entirely private. She started recording her own life story, alone, speaking directly into hours of private audio that almost nobody around her knew existed in any complete form. This decision reflected something that had defined Lisa Marie's relationship with her own history for decades. She had spent most of her adult life navigating public fascination with her father's legacy, while keeping the most painful personal details of her own experience carefully guarded. She gave interviews over the years touching on her childhood, her relationship with Elvis, her own struggles with grief and loss. But the full, unfiltered version of her story, including details she had apparently never shared even with her own children, remained locked away until she finally decided, late in her life, to commit it directly to audio recording. The project eventually became the foundation for a memoir, From Here to the Great Unknown, intended originally as Lisa Marie's own account of her life, in her own words, finally telling the complete story she had spent decades keeping private. She did not live to finish it. Lisa Marie Presley died suddenly in January of 2023, at the age of 54, from cardiac arrest connected to complications following earlier bariatric surgery. The loss devastated her family immediately and profoundly, arriving less than 3 years after the family had already endured the death of Lisa Marie's son, Benjamin, in 2020. Following her mother's death, Riley Keough faced an enormous, deeply personal task: completing the memoir her mother had started, using the hours of private audio recordings Lisa Marie had made before her death, finishing a book that had originally been intended as her mother's own solo account, now requiring Riley to step directly into that unfinished project as both daughter and co-author. This process required Riley to listen, carefully and repeatedly, through hours of her mother's private recorded memories, many covering territory Lisa Marie had apparently never discussed with her directly while alive. Riley has described this experience in subsequent interviews as one of learning entirely new details about her own family, discovering pieces of her mother's, and by extension, her grandfather's history for the first time, despite having grown up immersed in the broader Presley family legacy her entire life. This detail carries genuine emotional weight, specifically because of the relationship between mother and daughter that had defined Riley's entire childhood. Lisa Marie had been present throughout Riley's life, a constant, if complicated, parental figure managing her own grief and instability while raising her children across multiple households and relationships. Yet, apparently, significant portions of Lisa Marie's own deepest personal history, particularly regarding her father's final years and his death, had remained unspoken even within this close, ongoing relationship. The recordings, by their nature, offered Riley something her mother's living presence, despite years of closeness, had never fully provided. A direct, uninterrupted account of Lisa Marie's own perspective, recorded specifically with the intention of finally telling her complete story, without the usual social pressures or protective instincts that might otherwise shape what a parent chooses to share directly with a child in conversation. Riley has spoken about this distinction, specifically in promotional interviews surrounding the book's eventual release, including her extended conversation with Oprah Winfrey for a CBS special that aired in October of 2024. She described the recordings as revealing a side of her mother that felt, in important ways, more complete and more honest than even their closest in-person conversations had managed to capture during Lisa Marie's lifetime. This pattern, a parent reserving their most complete, unguarded self-reflection for a private recording rather than direct conversation with their own child, reflects something psychologically significant about how deeply painful family history sometimes gets processed and shared. Speaking directly to a recording device, with no immediate audience reacting in real time, can create space for a kind of honesty that even close, loving relationships sometimes struggle to accommodate directly. For Riley, completing her mother's memoir using these recordings became simultaneously an act of grief processing and an act of genuine historical discovery. She was mourning her mother, while also, through that same process, learning new, previously unknown details about her mother's life, and, by extension, her grandfather's final years and the broader Presley family history she had grown up within, but never fully understood from this particular, deeply personal angle. The book was eventually selected as Oprah Winfrey's 108th book club pick, a significant marker of its broader cultural impact and reach once it finally reached publication. This selection brought Lisa Marie's finally completed story to a vastly wider audience than any of her previous, more limited interviews touching on her father's legacy had ever achieved. Riley's role in this process extended beyond simple editorial completion. She had to make countless decisions about how to organize, contextualize, and present her mother's recorded memories, transforming hours of personal, sometimes meandering private reflection into a coherent, publishable narrative. This required Riley to develop her own deep, considered relationship with material that was, by its very nature, intensely personal and frequently painful, covering not just her grandfather's death, but her mother's own subsequent decades of grief, addiction struggles, and the more recent, devastating loss of her brother Benjamin. Among the most significant revelations contained within these recordings was Lisa Marie's own detailed account of August the 16th, 1977, the day her father died. This represented, according to Riley's own later description, the first time her mother had ever discussed that specific day in such complete, unguarded detail, even after decades of occasional public reflection on her father's death in broader, less specific terms. That account, finally surfacing through these private recordings nearly 5 decades after the events themselves, would become one of the most emotionally significant portions of the entire memoir. The day she knew before anyone told her. Among the recordings, Riley Keough listened to after her mother's death. One specific memory stood apart from everything else. Lisa Marie's own detailed account of August the 16th, 1977, the morning Elvis Presley died. According to Riley's later description of these recordings, her mother described a final exchange with her father that neither of them recognized in the moment as significant. Elvis was returning from playing racquetball in the early morning hours. Lisa Marie, then 9 years old, was heading out toward her golf cart, the way she often did at Graceland, moving freely around the property in the easy, unstructured way children of extraordinary wealth and privacy sometimes do. The two passed each other briefly near the back entrance leading out to the patio. They said goodnight. Nothing more dramatic than that, by every account Riley has since shared publicly. Just two family members crossing paths for a few seconds, exchanging the kind of small, automatic farewell that happens dozens of times in any household, rarely remembered specifically unless something afterward gives it unexpected weight. This particular goodnight became, according to Lisa Marie's own recorded recollection, the last time she ever spoke directly with her father. Riley has described this detail as one of the most affecting moments contained within her mother's private recordings, precisely because of its ordinariness. There was no dramatic final conversation, No meaningful last words exchanged with any awareness of what was coming. Just an unremarkable goodnight between a father and his 9-year-old daughter, who would, within hours, become a child whose entire life had irreversibly changed. The recordings reveal something else significant about Lisa Marie's own experience of that final day, something extending beyond this single brief exchange. According to her own account, she had developed over time a kind of instinctive sensitivity to her father's declining condition, even at her young age. She described in the recordings sometimes finding him in his bathroom, appearing disoriented, or holding on to railings to help maintain his balance, details a 9-year-old should never have needed to notice or understand. Yet details Lisa Marie apparently absorbed regardless, processing them in whatever limited way a child that age could manage. This pattern of childhood awareness extended into something even more striking, according to what Riley discovered within the recordings. Lisa Marie revealed that she had, as a young child, written letters expressing a specific recurring fear. She wrote, in her own words from that period, that she hoped her father would not die. This detail carries enormous emotional weight once properly understood within its full context. A child, still years away from fully developing the cognitive and emotional tools necessary to process complex fear and grief, had nonetheless absorbed enough from her surrounding environment. The visible decline, the household tension, perhaps overheard conversations among the adults around her, to develop a specific articulated fear that her father might actually die, expressed directly enough that she put it into writing during her own childhood. For Riley, encountering this detail decades later through her mother's recorded reflection represented a genuinely significant moment of retrospective understanding. It suggested that Lisa Marie's eventual, actual experience of her father's death, while certainly devastating in the way any child's loss of a parent would be, was not received as a completely unexpected shock arriving without any prior context. Some part of young Lisa Marie had already quietly and privately anticipated this exact possibility, carrying that fear silently for some unknown period before it eventually proved tragically accurate. This detail also reframes how Riley, and by extension, audiences encountering the completed memoir, might understand Lisa Marie's lifelong relationship with grief and anticipatory anxiety regarding loss. A pattern that, according to the broader memoir, would resurface decades later in devastating, specific ways connected to the death of her own son, Benjamin, in 2020. The recordings reveal that Lisa Marie had carried this specific story, the goodnight exchange, the bathroom observations, the childhood letters expressing fear of her father's death, for nearly 5 decades without sharing it in this particular, complete form with anyone publicly. Riley has noted that even within their own close relationship, her mother had apparently never previously discussed these specific details with this level of completeness, making their discovery through the recordings genuinely new information for Riley herself, despite having grown up as her mother's daughter throughout her entire life. This pattern, a parent finally revealing previously unspoken details only through a private, deliberately recorded reflection rather than through ordinary conversation, speaks to something significant about how certain forms of grief resist easy articulation, even within otherwise close, trusting relationships. Some memories, apparently, require the specific distance and deliberate intention of formal recording before they can finally be spoken aloud at all, even decades after the events themselves occurred. For audiences eventually encountering this material through the completed memoir and through Riley's own subsequent interviews discussing it, the detail of Lisa Marie's childhood letters carries particular resonance. It transforms the popular understanding of Elvis Presley's declining health and eventual death from something experienced primarily through adult perspectives, doctors, bodyguards, household staff, into something a young child had also been quietly, privately processing throughout the same period, carrying fears and observations that nobody around her likely fully recognized or addressed directly at the time. Riley's own reflection on discovering this material suggests she came to understand her mother's lifelong relationship with grief differently as a result. Lisa Marie had not simply experienced her father's death as a singular, isolated childhood trauma. She had been quietly anticipating and fearing exactly this outcome for some unknown period beforehand, carrying that private fear long before it eventually proved accurate, and apparently carrying the full, complete memory of that experience largely alone for nearly 5 decades afterward. That weight, carried silently for so long, would resurface again, decades later, in ways that connected directly to loss far closer to Lisa Marie's own immediate family. What Riley didn't expect to find, beyond the specific details surrounding Elvis's final day, Riley Keough has described encountering material throughout her mother's recordings that reshaped her broader understanding of her own family history, details extending well past her grandfather's death into the decades that followed. According to Riley's own account, shared during her extended conversation with Oprah Winfrey, working through her mother's recordings meant learning new things about her family generally, not simply filling in additional detail around stories she had already known in outline. Some of what surfaced involved Lisa Marie's own adult life and relationships, details she had apparently never discussed in this particular depth with her own daughter, despite their ongoing closeness throughout Riley's adult life. This process required Riley to occupy an unusual dual role. She was simultaneously a grieving daughter, processing the sudden loss of her mother, and an active participant in uncovering new, previously unknown information about that same mother's interior life and history. These two experiences, grief and discovery, occurred simultaneously rather than sequentially, creating what Riley has described as a genuinely complex, emotional experience throughout the entire process of completing the memoir. The recordings reportedly included extended reflection on Lisa Marie's relationship with her own son, Benjamin Storm Keough, material that became especially significant given his death by suicide in July of 2020, less than 3 years before Lisa Marie's own death. Riley has spoken about her mother's recorded reflections on this relationship, including specific details about how closely Benjamin's personality and presence echoed his grandfather's, a connection that apparently weighed heavily on Lisa Marie throughout her son's life, and that intensified considerably following his death. According to material Riley has discussed publicly, Lisa Marie described Benjamin as remarkably similar to Elvis, not simply in occasional mannerisms, but in a deeper, more pervasive way that she found genuinely unsettling at points throughout his life. She apparently chose not to share this specific observation directly with Benjamin himself while he was alive, reportedly believing the weight of that comparison. Living explicitly in the shadow of a grandfather he never met but apparently resembled so closely, represented too significant a burden to place directly onto a child already navigating his own struggles. This detail, surfacing only through the private recordings rather than through any prior conversation Lisa Marie had with Riley while still alive, added a new and considerably more painful dimension to Riley's understanding of her brother's life and eventual death. It suggested her mother had been quietly carrying this specific weighted observation alone for years, recognizing patterns in her son that connected directly back to her own father's life and ultimate fate, without ever fully articulating that connection to anyone close to her, including her own children. Riley has also discussed material from the recordings addressing her mother's own decades-long struggle with substance use, struggles that intensified considerably following Benjamin's death. According to Riley's account, working through Ben's phone after his death, she and her mother together discovered a message he had sent, expressing that he believed he was dealing with a mental health condition, a detail that surprised Riley specifically because she had understood her brother's struggles primarily through the lens of substance use and erratic behavior, rather than recognizing an underlying mental health dimension she had not previously identified clearly. This discovery, made jointly by Riley and her mother in the aftermath of Benjamin's death, appears to have represented a significant turning point in how both women understood what had actually happened, shifting their framework away from viewing his struggles as primarily about substance use toward recognizing a more complex, underlying mental health reality that had gone unaddressed. For Riley, encountering her mother's recorded reflections on this same period years later, following her mother's own subsequent death, added yet another layer of retrospective understanding. She has described recognizing, through these recordings, the moment she became genuinely concerned that her mother might not survive her own grief following Benjamin's death, an instinct that, tragically, proved prescient less than 3 years later. The recordings also reportedly captured smaller, more intimate details that humanized Lisa Marie in ways Riley found unexpectedly moving, despite their closeness throughout Riley's life. Riley has described finding her mother, in the years following Benjamin's death, frequently listening to Elvis's music alone, often while drinking, visibly emotional in ways that suggested grief for her father remained genuinely present and unresolved even decades after his actual death, now compounded directly by the fresh, devastating loss of her own son. This detail connects directly back to the childhood letters discovered earlier in the recordings, the young girl who had once written that she hoped her father would not die, grown into a woman who, decades later, continued processing that same loss privately, repeatedly, alongside the entirely separate but resonant grief of losing her own child. Riley has spoken about recognizing, through this combination of details scattered across her mother's recordings, a pattern extending across multiple generations of her family. Grief, observed quietly by children too young to fully process it. Loss, carried privately for decades without full articulation. Connections between generations, particularly the apparent resemblance between Benjamin and Elvis, recognized internally, but rarely spoken aloud, directly to the people most affected by them. Completing her mother's memoir using this material required Riley to hold all of these discoveries simultaneously, presenting her mother's full, complicated story honestly while also processing in real time her own complex feelings about learning so much new, significant information about her own family only after losing the person who had carried that information most directly and most privately for the majority of her life. What emerged from this process was a memoir considerably more complete and emotionally layered than anything Lisa Marie had previously shared publicly during her lifetime, finally giving voice to decades of carefully guarded family history that had remained, until these recordings, almost entirely unspoken. Grief inside. Grief. The losses connecting Riley Keough's family across 3 generations did not occur in isolation from one another. Each loss, according to the fuller picture revealed through Lisa Marie's recordings, echoed and intensified the ones that came before it. Benjamin Storm Keough died in July of 2020 at the age of 27 after years of struggling with substance use and what later understanding suggested was an underlying, unaddressed mental health condition. His death devastated Lisa Marie in ways that those close to her described as profound, even by the standard of losing a child, an experience that ranks among the most painful any parent can endure. According to details Riley has since shared publicly, her mother's response to this loss extended well beyond typical grieving timelines and conventional mourning practices. Lisa Marie made the decision to keep Benjamin's casket inside her own home for approximately 2 months following his death, working with a compassionate funeral director who explained the process necessary to preserve his body during this extended period, including regular dry ice treatments to maintain appropriate conditions throughout those weeks. Riley has described her mother's reasoning for this unusual arrangement with evident understanding rather than judgment. Lisa Marie was not ready, in the immediate aftermath of her son's death, to complete the finality of burial. Keeping his body close, sitting with him regularly during those 2 months, apparently provided some measure of comfort during an otherwise unbearable period, allowing her to extend her goodbye rather than facing an abrupt, immediate separation she did not yet feel prepared to accept. This detail, while undeniably unconventional by typical standards, reflects something Riley has come to understand more fully through her mother's broader recorded reflections. Lisa Marie's entire life had been shaped by sudden, devastating loss arriving without adequate warning or preparation, beginning with her father's death when she was only 9 years old. Her response to Benjamin's death, extending the process of separation as long as circumstances reasonably allowed, suggests a woman attempting, consciously or not, to manage grief differently than she had been forced to manage it as a child. When her father's death had arrived with brutal, immediate finality, she had no ability to control or delay. Eventually, Lisa Marie did proceed with Benjamin's burial, choosing to lay him to rest in the meditation garden at Graceland, the same private burial ground where Elvis himself had been buried decades earlier, alongside other members of the Presley family. This decision created a physical, permanent connection between her son and the grandfather he had never met, but apparently resembled so closely, a connection that would, less than 3 years later, extend to include Lisa Marie herself, following her own death. Riley has spoken about growing increasingly concerned for her mother's well-being during the period following Benjamin's death, recognizing patterns that, in retrospect, suggested her mother might not fully recover from this particular loss. She has described specific moments during this period, finding her mother alone, drinking, listening repeatedly to her father's music, visibly overwhelmed by grief that appeared to compound rather than separate her father's death and her son's death into two distinct, individually processed losses. This compounding effect, where one significant loss appears to reopen and intensify unresolved grief from an earlier loss, represents a pattern grief specialists and mental health professionals have long recognized in cases involving multiple, significant losses occurring within relatively close succession, particularly when the earlier loss occurred during childhood and was never fully processed at the time. For Lisa Marie specifically, her father's death at age 9 had occurred during a developmental period when she lacked the emotional and cognitive tools necessary to fully process such an enormous, sudden loss. Decades of apparent partial processing followed, the childhood letters expressing fear of his death, the lifelong complicated relationship with his musical legacy, the recordings that finally articulated details she had apparently never previously discussed, even with her own children. Benjamin's death in 2020, then, did not occur as an isolated, separate tragedy. It arrived directly into the same emotional territory that her father's death had carved out decades earlier, reopening and intensifying grief that had never been fully resolved in the first place. Riley's own retrospective understanding of this pattern developed substantially through listening to her mother's private recordings after her mother's subsequent death, has reshaped how she discusses her family's history publicly. Rather than presenting each loss as a separate, distinct event, she has described a more interconnected, cumulative pattern. One generation's unresolved grief, creating conditions that intensified and complicated the grief experienced by the following generation, in ways that, until these recordings finally surfaced, had never been fully or publicly articulated. This understanding carries direct relevance to how Riley has approached her own life and her own emerging family in the years since her mother's death. She has spoken about consciously trying to process her own grief, both for her brother and for her mother, more directly and completely than the pattern she observed across the previous 2 generations of her family, recognizing the specific risks inherent in allowing significant loss to remain unprocessed and unspoken for years or decades. The completed memoir itself, incorporating these difficult, interconnected details about loss across 3 generations of the Presley family, represents something considerably more emotionally complex than a typical celebrity memoir focused primarily on fame and public life. It functions, in significant part, as a multi-generational account of grief, finally articulated completely and publicly after decades of partial, fragmented, and often entirely private processing within the family itself. For Riley, completing this project meant confronting not just her own immediate grief over her mother's death, but the accumulated, interconnected weight of loss extending back through her mother's childhood and through her brother's more recent devastating death, finally giving voice to patterns that had shaped her family for nearly 5 decades without ever being fully spoken aloud in this complete, connected form. Finishing what her mother started. In October of 2024, Riley Keough sat across from Oprah Winfrey for a primetime CBS special, finally bringing her mother's completed story to a national audience. The special, titled The Presleys, Elvis, Lisa Marie, and Riley, marked Riley's first public interview since her mother's death nearly 2 years earlier. The conversation covered the material Riley had spent months working through, the recordings, the childhood letters, the good night at the patio door, the casket kept close for 2 months, the recognition that Benjamin had carried so much of his grandfather inside him without ever fully knowing it. Riley spoke about all of it with the particular steadiness of someone who had already lived through the hardest part of the telling, alone, months earlier, sitting with headphones and her mother's voice filling the silence her mother's absence had left behind. Winfrey, throughout the conversation, returned repeatedly to the emotional weight of Riley's task. Completing a memoir is rarely simple. Completing one built from a deceased parent's private recordings, discovering new family history in the process of mourning that same parent, represented something considerably more demanding. Riley described the work in straightforward terms, without dramatizing it further than the material itself already warranted. She had a responsibility to tell her mother's story accurately, and she intended to honor that responsibility, regardless of how difficult the listening and writing became along the way. The memoir itself, From Here to the Great Unknown, was selected as Oprah Winfrey's 108th Book Club pick, ensuring Lisa Marie's finally completed story reached an audience far larger than any single interview could have managed alone. For Riley, this reach mattered beyond simple commercial success. It meant her mother's voice, recorded in private during her final years and never intended to remain hidden forever, would finally be heard exactly as Lisa Marie had wanted to tell it, rather than filtered through decades of secondhand retelling or tabloid speculation that had followed the Presley family throughout Lisa Marie's entire life. Riley's role in this story extended beyond co-author. Following her mother's death, she became sole owner of Graceland itself, inheriting not just the estate, but the full weight of presiding over her grandfather's legacy and her mother's complicated relationship to it. She now manages the sub-trusts belonging to her two half-sisters as well, each entitled to a share of their mother's estate, placing Riley directly at the center of a family structure her own grandfather had built decades before she was born. This inheritance carries a particular irony Riley has acknowledged in her own reflections. She spent her childhood once removed from Elvis, never meeting him, absorbing his legacy secondhand through her mother and through Graceland's tourists, who often seemed to know more curated facts about her grandfather than she herself had grown up knowing personally. She now stands as the direct steward of that same legacy, responsible for a story she only fully understood after her mother had already died and could no longer tell it herself. Riley has also spoken about the strange duality of becoming, simultaneously, a new mother herself during this same period. Her daughter, born via surrogate in August of 2022, arrived only months before Lisa Marie's death, meaning Riley stepped into motherhood and into the loss of her own mother within the same brief, overwhelming window of time. She has described finding particular meaning in that overlap, a new generation beginning, just as the previous one's story was finally being completed and told in full for the first time. What the recordings ultimately gave Riley was not closure in any simple sense. It was something closer to inheritance in its truest form, not property or trust funds, but the actual, complete story of where she came from, finally spoken aloud by the one person who had carried it longest and most privately. The goodnight exchange at the patio door, the childhood letters, the years of quiet, compounding grief passed silently from one generation to the next, until Lisa Marie finally broke that silence, even if only into a recording device, even if only completed and shared after she was already gone. For a family defined for nearly 5 decades by public fascination and private grief existing side by side, this final act, a daughter finishing her mother's recorded story and carrying it forward into the world, represents something the Presley family had rarely managed before. A loss, finally and fully spoken, rather than carried alone. 3 generations, one story, finally told in full. Riley Keough didn't just finish her mother's book, she finished the conversation Lisa Marie never had the chance to have out loud. If this story moved you, subscribe for more honest accounts from the families who lived history firsthand.